Dawn broke on August 19, 1942, as Operation Jubilee, one of the most controversial raids of World War II, began to unfold. The mission's true nature was almost unthinkable. Nearly 6,000 Allied troops would risk their lives to capture a heavily defended, German-held French port, only to abandon it entirely on purpose, mere hours later. This wasn't just a raid, it was a deadly dress rehearsal. Allied commanders needed to test the feasibility of seizing such a port for the eventual invasion of Europe. Dieppe would serve as their proving ground, with success measured not in territory gained, but in lessons learned, lessons paid for in blood. As the largest air armada yet assembled in the war, 74 squadrons of RAF and Allied fighters and bombers filled the skies above the English Channel. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on those involved. They were about to execute a plan that deliberately placed thousands of lives at risk for a temporary victory. The objectives went beyond the visible goal of briefly holding Dieppe. Hidden beneath the surface was a desperate hunt for intelligence on German defenses, advanced radar systems, and the enigmatic Enigma coding machines. This information could potentially shorten the war by years, a tantalizing prize that justified in the minds of Allied planners the enormous risk. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, two key figures prepared for their roles in this high-stakes gamble. Flight Sergeant John Brooks of the 174th Squadron, in his heavily armed Hurricane fighter bomber, represented the operation's aggressive air support. On the sea below, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment steeled himself to lead the assault on Pourville's Green Beach. At 4:50 a.m., as Merritt's troops hit the sand, Brooks and his squadron began their attack runs. But almost immediately, the plan began to unravel. German defenses, forewarned by an earlier naval skirmish, were fully alert and ready. Within hours, the beaches of Dieppe became a crucible of combat. Merritt's men fought desperately to cross the Sai River Bridge, while above, Brooks and his comrades engaged in frantic dogfights. The air filled with the cacophony of war, the roar of planes, the staccato of machine guns, and the thunder of exploding bombs. By mid-morning, it was clear the operation was in jeopardy. The RAF struggled to provide continuous cover, while many units were pinned down or decimated on the ground. The stakes were enormous. Failure meant death or capture for thousands, and success could pave the way for future invasions. The next few hours would reshape the entire strategy for liberating Europe. But for who? Amidst the chaos, Merritt knew he had to rally his men. Standing fully exposed on the bridge under withering fire, he called out, quote, "Come on over, there's nothing to it," swinging his helmet. As Operation Jubilee unraveled, the men on the ground would fight to the bitter end. All while a secret commando team split off from the main force on a mission that wouldn't come to light for decades. The summer of 1942 found the Allies in a precarious position. The Soviet Union, bearing the brunt of Nazi Germany's onslaught, desperately called for a second front in Western Europe. In North America, the Canadian public clamored for their troops to see action after years of training in Britain. Beyond the visible military objectives, Operation Jubilee had an additional and incredibly secret agenda. Allied intelligence saw an opportunity for commandos to gather crucial information on German defenses and technology. Of particular interest were the Germans' advanced radar systems and any materials related to their Enigma coding machines. Success in these covert aims could provide invaluable insights for future operations and potentially shorten the war. Operation Jubilee, the raid on Dieppe, was born out of this pressure. Originally conceived as Operation Rudder, it was cancelled in July due to poor weather. Its revival as Jubilee was a calculated risk. Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, acting commander of the Canadian Corps, had pushed for Canadian involvement, fearing, quote, "a tragic humiliation if American troops get into action before Canadians, who have been waiting in England for 3 years." The plan called for a frontal assault on the French port of Dieppe, with Canadian infantry and tanks landing on the beach while British commandos attacked nearby coastal batteries. The Royal Air Force and Royal Canadian Air Force would provide air support with 74 squadrons, one of the largest air operations of the war to date. Flight Sergeant John Brooks of 174 Squadron was among the pilots preparing for the raid. In his memoirs, recounted by his son, the tension of the briefing on August 18th was palpable. Quote, "Dad and his colleagues weren't told about the raid until orders were given on August 14th to move to RAF Ford. His entry in his logbook states, 'To Ford, for what?' Brooks and his fellow pilots would be tasked with dive-bombing naval guns overlooking the port. On the ground, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment readied his men for their role in the assault. They aimed to land at Pourville, west of Dieppe, and push inland to capture an airfield and destroy a coastal battery. Merritt, like many Canadian officers, was eager for action. As Corporal Robert Prowse of the Canadian Provost Corps put it, quote, "Like every other soldier, I was bored to tears with the long inaction and was itching for battle." The Germans, however, were not caught entirely off guard. While they didn't expect a major assault, their 302nd Infantry Division manned strong defences along the coast. The port of Dieppe was surrounded by steep cliffs, providing natural vantage points for machine gun and artillery positions. The beach was covered in stones, proving treacherous for landing craft and tanks alike. As the Allied force of 6,086 men, including 4,963 Canadians, boarded their ships on the evening of August 18th, they were unaware of the formidable challenge that awaited them. Major General J. Hamilton Roberts, commander of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, expressed confidence in the plan, but his optimism would soon be tested. The air component of the raid was equally ambitious. Air Marshal Lee Mallory assembled 74 squadrons, including fighters, fighter bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Their mission was to provide cover for the naval and ground forces, suppress enemy defenses, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching Dieppe. As dawn approached on August 19th, the invasion fleet neared the French coast. Flight Sergeant Brooks and his fellow pilots took off from airfields in southern England, their aircraft laden with bombs and extra fuel. On the landing craft, Colonel Merritt and his men steeled themselves for the assault. The stage was set for one of the war's most controversial and costly operations. As General Bernard Montgomery had noted in July, the raid's success depended on average luck. However, as the first shots were fired in the early hours of August 19th, it quickly became clear that luck was not on the Allies' side. As the first light of dawn broke on August 19th, 1942, Operation Jubilee commenced with a flurry of aerial activity. At 4:50 a.m., RAF and RCAF squadrons roared across the Channel, their mission to soften German defences and provide cover for the approaching landing craft. Flight Sergeant John Brooks, piloting his Hurricane, was among the first wave. He vividly recalled the scene in his memoirs. Quote, "It was quite easy to make out the coast and the town of Dieppe. The ship on fire lit up the whole scene clearly, and the flak and fireworks were on par to November 5th. Brooks and his squadron dove towards their targets, releasing their payloads of 500-pound bombs on the German gun emplacements. However, the air assault faced immediate challenges. As Air Marshal Lee Mallory noted in his after-action report, quote, "Bombing attacks on battery positions were not as effective as smoke. I had reckoned on certain batteries opening fire on their SOS lines after our flank landings had begun at 4:50. Still, these were very slow in getting into action." The lack of heavy bombers, a decision made to maintain the element of surprise, would prove costly. On the sea, the initial landings were met with disaster. At 3:20 a.m., the flotilla carrying No. 3 Commando collided with a German coastal convoy. The ensuing firefight alerted the German defenses, eliminating the crucial surprise element. The main assaults began at 5:20 a.m., but almost immediately things went awry. At Puys, just east of Dieppe, the Royal Regiment of Canada landed 35 minutes late. In the growing daylight, they were easy targets for the German defenders. Colonel Merritt's South Saskatchewan Regiment fared slightly better at Pourville, achieving some surprise, but part of the unit was landed in the wrong location. The central attack on Dieppe's main beach was a catastrophe from the start. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and Essex Scottish Regiment faced withering fire as they struggled across the stone-covered beach. Their supporting tanks from the 14th Canadian Army Tank Regiment arrived late, and many became stuck on the beach, unable to cross the seawall. The Allies' mistakes were numerous and costly. The decision to attack a well-defended port, the lack of heavy naval bombardment, and the over-reliance on surprise all contributed to the unfolding disaster. As historian Timothy Balzer noted, quote, "It was madness to land on a beach in front of Dieppe, where stones impeded the tank's progress. Did no one think?" The Germans, on the other hand, reacted swiftly and effectively to the threat. Despite the initial surprise at Pourville, they quickly brought their defensive firepower to bear. The 302nd Infantry Division, manning the coastal defenses, unleashed a hail of fire from their advantageous positions on the cliffs overlooking the beaches. As the morning wore on, it became increasingly clear that Operation Jubilee was unraveling. The meticulously planned raid, which had seemed feasible in the war rooms of England, had devolved into chaos on the shores of Dieppe. The troops on the ground, like Colonel Merritt's men struggling to cross the Sai River Bridge, were left to face the consequences of these strategic and tactical failures. On the blood-soaked beaches and in the skies above, Canadian and British forces faced a hellish ordeal. At Pourville, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment found himself in a desperate situation. His men were pinned down, unable to cross the Sai River Bridge under intense German fire. In a moment of extraordinary courage, Merritt stood up, took off his helmet, and taunted the Germans. His actions galvanized his troops, who followed him across the bridge and up the hill to engage the German positions. In the air, Flight Sergeant John Brooks of 174 Squadron was witnessing the carnage from above. During his second sortie, he saw a friend's plane get hit. Quote, "I saw one of our Hurricanes get hit and catch fire. He dived straight at a bunch of armored vehicles and blew up." The intensity of the air battle was unprecedented. As Brooks recalled, quote, I could see the 40mm stuff curving up towards us, for all the world like a lot of bright glowing beads on a string. It would flash past us and explode just above our heads, or so it appeared. The 14th Canadian Army Tank Regiment tanks meant to provide crucial support were in trouble from the start. Sergeant George Hacking described the scene, quote, "When we got to the beach, I saw a Churchill tank burning fiercely. Another tank was stuck in the shingle. Men were lying all over." Of the 29 tanks that landed, only 15 made it off the beach, and none returned to England. On the main beach, Private Leo Gariepi of the Fusiliers Mont-Royal, part of the floating reserve, landed into a maelstrom. Quote, "The beach was a shambles. There were wounded everywhere. Some were drowning in the incoming tide." Despite the chaos, Gariepi and his comrades pressed on, trying to provide support to the beleaguered Essex Scottish and Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. Flight Sergeant Mihu Zobel's Spitfire was hit during the intense aerial combat. Despite a head injury from an exploding cannon shell and severe damage to his aircraft's rudder, Zobel managed to return to base. After being grounded by medical officers, he bitterly remarked, quote, "I missed a lot of fun." On the Allied side, Major General J. Hamilton Roberts, aboard HMS Calpe, struggled to grasp the gravity of the scene. At 7:52 a.m., he made a fateful decision, cancelling support on Bismarck and Rommel positions based on garbled reports of success. This miscommunication had dire consequences, with the mistaken belief that a second landing on Blue Beach had succeeded. Crucial air support was diverted away from where it was desperately needed. By 8:30 a.m., the situation had deteriorated significantly on the western flank, with heavy opposition coming from the western headland and houses behind the beach. Meanwhile, German leaders reacted swiftly to the threat. The 302nd Infantry Division, initially surprised by the scale of the attack, quickly mobilized its reserves. Initially slow to respond, German air forces ramped up their efforts as the day progressed. By 10 a.m., enemy bombers appeared in force, escorted by fighters. While initially successful in providing cover, the Allied air offensive faced mounting challenges. Lee Mallory reported, quote, "To counter this increased enemy activity and in order to cover re-embarkation which was about to commence, the strength of fighter cover over Dieppe was increased from 3 to 6 and at times to 9 squadrons." The German counter-offensive on the ground was ruthlessly efficient. Machine gun nests and artillery positions on the cliffs overlooking the beaches proved devastating. As the morning wore on, the futility of the operation became clear. Aboard the headquarters ship HMS Calpe, Major General Roberts received increasingly desperate reports. At 9:56 p.m., in response to his request for a report, he received a chilling reply. Quote, "Situation too obscure to give useful report. Air cooperation faultless. Enemy air opposition now increasing." By early afternoon, the order for withdrawal was given, but even the retreat proved dangerous. Sergeant Charles Crate of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry described the scene, quote, "It was just a slaughter. We were just like sitting ducks." In the skies, Allied pilots fought desperately to cover the withdrawal. Flight Lieutenant James Witham of 401 Squadron RCF engaged in intense dogfights, destroying one Focke-Wulf 190 and damaging another during the battle. At Pourville, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt stayed behind to organize the defenses that allowed some of his men to escape. His actions would earn him the Victoria Cross. On the main beach, the scene was chaotic. Private Leo Gariepi of the Fusiliers Mont-Royal described the withdrawal, quote, "Those who could walk helped the wounded to the boats. We had to leave many behind." In a particularly poignant moment, Brigadier Southam of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry remained on the beach, calmly smoking his pipe and encouraging his men to evacuate until he was eventually taken prisoner. The air battle continued to rage during the withdrawal. At 10:30 a.m., in a prearranged attack, 24 American Flying Fortress bombers, escorted by 4 Spitfire 9 squadrons, struck the German fighter aerodrome at Abbeville-Drucart. This raid, dropping 25 tons of explosives, caused significant disruption to German air operations, providing some relief to the retreating forces. As the last Allied ships left the area around 2:20 p.m., smoke-laying aircraft provided a protective screen between the retreating forces and the German coastal defenses. On one of his final sorties of the day, Flight Sergeant John Brooks noted the grim scene below. Quote, "There was an extraordinary amount of rubbish floating around in the water, quite some way off the shore. There were bright yellow dinghies which stood out against a surface of oil and sundry junk. I then realized the items floating in the water were bodies." The raid's aftermath revealed its staggering cost. Of the 6,086 men who embarked, 3,623 were lost, wounded, or captured. The Royal Navy lost 550 officers and ratings. The Air Forces suffered 106 aircraft shot down, their heaviest single day's losses of the war to that point. Despite the disaster, there were individual acts of extraordinary heroism. The German 81st Corps report, while critical of the overall operation, acknowledged, quote, "The enemy, almost entirely Canadian soldiers, fought, so far as he was able to fight at all, well and bravely." As the sun set on August 19, 1942, the beaches of Dieppe bore silent witness to the human cost of what would be remembered as one of the most controversial operations of World War II. The Dieppe raid left an indelible mark on the war's trajectory, its repercussions rippling through Allied and Axis forces alike. For Canada, the human cost was staggering. A nation mourned as news of the casualties filtered back across the Atlantic. Yet, a different narrative quickly took shape in the halls of power. When faced with a potential public relations disaster, Lord Louis Mountbatten's Combined Operations Headquarters swiftly reframed the raid as a crucial learning experience. As historian Timothy Balzer points out, this spin persisted even as the grim casualty lists became public. In Germany, the initial shock at the raid's scale gave way to a surge of confidence. The successful defense of Dieppe seemed to validate the strength of the Atlantic Wall, inadvertently sowing seeds of overconfidence that would later prove costly on D-Day. Despite the heavy losses, the raid did yield valuable lessons. Air Marshal Lee Mallory's after-action report highlighted critical insights that would shape future amphibious operations. The importance of air superiority, the need for heavy naval bombardment, and the crucial role of specialized amphibious vehicles all emerged as key takeaways. Perhaps most significantly, the disastrous attempt to seize a fortified port underscored the wisdom of targeting less defended beaches in future invasions. These hard-won lessons profoundly influenced the planning for Operation Overlord. The development of Hobart's funnies, amphibious DD tanks, and improved landing craft all stem from the bitter experience at Dieppe. The emphasis on pre-invasion bombing and naval bombardment in the D-Day plans also reflected the lessons learned from the raid's failures. For the Americans, who had a small contingent of Army Rangers at Dieppe, the raid reinforced their preference for landing on open beaches rather than assaulting fortified ports. This strategy would prove successful in their subsequent operations in North Africa, Sicily, and eventually Normandy. The legacy of the Dieppe raid remains a subject of debate. Lord Mountbatten's claim that, quote, "For every man who died in Dieppe, at least 10 more must have been spared in Normandy in 1944, stands in stark contrast to the Globe and Mail's 1943 assessment of the raid as, quote, "a fiasco of the first order, a tragedy of military blundering without parallel in this war." While the raid's public outcome was disastrous, its covert intelligence mission yielded unexpected dividends. In the chaos of the assault, a small team managed to capture crucial documents and components related to German radar systems. Though they failed to secure an Enigma machine, the intel gathered provided valuable insights into German coastal defenses and communication methods. This information proved instrumental in subsequent Allied planning. Thus, even in failure, Operation Jubilee made a significant, if costly, contribution to the ultimate Allied victory. The full extent of its intelligence impact remained classified for decades, a hidden silver lining to one of the war's darkest days.